Reverend Joe Ellwanger, who got his first church in Birmingham, Alabama in 1958. 58. So, and it was well, I'm going to let him explain it. But he was also, I met Reverend Ellwanger when he was the pastor at Cross Lutheran Church, which is up on 16th and Walnut, 17th and Walnut, in that area. And it was, when I met him, he was the pastor there. He's now retired, or at least semi-retired. But it was a church that was at the center of social activism in Milwaukee. When he was in Birmingham, he was there really during the period when a lot of the events that you're going to see in this film took place. And I saw this film right after I read this book this summer called Carry Me Home, which is a book written by Diane McWhorter, whose father was came out of one of the steel baron families in Birmingham, Alabama. And in the very beginning of the book, I just want to read you what she wrote and why we're showing this film, which is more about civil rights than it is about the labor movement, but the two are related. She wrote, "Birmingham was different from other cities. It was southern and it had industry, steel, the business that built America. And because it had industry, it had a concentration of workers. And because workers were treated badly by industrialists, the labor movement, as well as the Communist Party, paid Birmingham special attention, introducing it to a tradition of organized protest unheard of anywhere else in the South. The forces of progress, however, had been no sweat for the forces of money until President Franklin D. Roosevelt sensationally wheeled the U.S. government around to the side of the have-nots in the 1930s, empowering the workers to unite against the bosses. And that is where the story of 1963 really begins. At the time Sid Meier's own public career was launched during the New Deal, when segregation itself was not only a racist ideology, but also a means to an economic end. The civil rights movement was created from the rib of organized labor, and the industrialists answered it with a grassroots counteroffensive of hooded vigilantes and the queerest Tory politician in history, a loudmouth hick named Bull Connor. So I'd like to introduce Reverend Ellwanger and ask him to come up and say a few words before we watch the film.
First, I should probably ask whether there's anybody here from Birmingham. Perhaps not. But I've sometimes said that I'm grateful that my first call was not to Bismarck, North Dakota, but instead to the African American community in Birmingham, Alabama, in southwest Birmingham, Titusville to be precise, 6th Avenue and 2nd Street South. A small brick church building, St. Paul Lutheran Church. And I came there wet behind the ears. And the only thing I had going for me in terms of being open to what then happened in the 60s is the fact that my dad was a pastor in St. Louis, Missouri during the Depression years, and of all things was a pastor in a storefront church. And I mean, where have you heard of a Lutheran storefront church? Doesn't make sense in Wisconsin, but my dad was walking with people at the edges, and I went with him sometimes growing up there. And then he moved to Selma, Alabama in 1945. We moved. I was in the 8th grade. And that, of course, was still very much Jim Crow days. My father was president of Alabama Lutheran Academy and College in Selma, which was the high school and junior college serving 33 black Lutheran churches in central Alabama and southern Alabama, taking students who had come from the elementary schools and preparing teachers to go back to those schools. So I had my feet in both communities in Selma, growing up as an 8th grader, 9th grader, 10th grader, going to a white school, but going on Sundays with my father to places like Possum Bend and Camden, Alabama, and Vineland and Tidwell, and all those places you won't even find on the map, but seeing black tenant farmers just making it. And that's what prepared me to think about, this isn't right and something needs to be done. And when I came to Birmingham, then in 1958, as a young pastor, I was definitely open to making change. And I understand that the movie that's going to be shown is going to focus especially on Birmingham in the 60s. And I was there, that's where I cut my eye teeth on both who I am, who I wanted to be, and what kind of pastor I wanted to be. So maybe we should see the film, and I will respond, especially if there are some events in there that I was either aware of or maybe even participated in. We'll see what happens.
Let me ask you a question. Did you consider yourself an activist?
I slowly became an activist. As a matter of fact, I ultimately led a march in Selma the day before Bloody Sunday, 72 white Alabamians to the courthouse of Dallas County in solidarity with the voting rights movement that had been taking place from January of '65 until March 6th that was. And so, I definitely was ready finally to be in the public square and to be a part of the movement. I was there for the Turnaround Tuesday event 2 days after Bloody Sunday, and then for the final day of the Selma and Montgomery March. So I think you would say that makes.
But that's not is that the tradition of the Lutheran Church from the socialist perspective?
No, it isn't.
I knew that answer when I was asking.
As a matter of fact, the picture on the book that I just finally wrote includes the story of this march in Selma, and here is the sheriff's deputy at the county courthouse reading a telegram from what in effect was my bishop, although he was president of the Southern District of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And the telegram says, the Reverend Joseph Ellwanger, in leading the march in Selma today, does not represent the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And in no way does the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod support him in this action. So if you ask whether this was the usual, quite the unusual tension and that clash of segregation, yesterday segregation, today segregation forever, Jim Crow, determination to maintain that way of life, and this freedom movement that seems almost surreal. You look at that, you say, where did that courage come from? Where did that wind come from? And it was a powerful time when you think about the Montgomery bus boycott was 55-56. And things gelled, but the Southern Christian Leadership Conference didn't move into high gear in 57, 58, 59, 60. The Freedom Rides really did break things loose. And the big movements that brought about the Civil Rights Law of '64 that we heard at the end there was the Birmingham demonstrations in '63 And then the Voting Rights Act, which really changed the scenario in our country, was 65. So you see how one built on the other. But that spirit of the times, especially that fervent determination in the black community, was for real. And I have to tell you the story and it comes from 1961, the same year that the Freedom Rides took place. There was a white Lutheran church in Tuscaloosa that invited the youth from the congregation that I pastored, and that was a black congregation, to come to Tuscaloosa for a Sunday evening time together for the youth to share stories, to have a meal together, and to have worship together, just a good evening of fellowship. And you know, that's an out-of-the-box invitation. It was out of the box for the white youth and the white intern pastor to invite us. And when I asked the youth in my congregation, are any of you interested in going, it was an out-of-the-box decision for any of them to go. 2 girls said that they were ready to go. So we went, the 2 girls and myself, 2 15-year-old girls, and we had a great evening. In fact, it was so great that on the way back, Carolyn Freeman and Betty Wells were talking with each other in the back seat, back and forth, just excited about this evening, and why can't we do more of this, and this is what the church is all about, we ought to be building bridges, and they were waxing eloquent. And it was Wednesday of that week that I picked the paper up off of the front porch, and there the headlines and the picture and the front page of the Birmingham paper was the story of the white intern pastor in Tuscaloosa having been picked up by the Ku Klux Klan, taken to the edge of the city, beaten, and left to walk back to the city at 1, 2 o'clock in the morning on the railroad track, and a cross burned on the lawn of the church that had hosted us, and a note on the door that said, if there is ever another integrated youth meeting in this church, it will be worse the next time for you. And I hadn't finished reading the article in the paper when the phone rang, and a voice, a rough voice on the other end asked, "Is this the Reverend?" And I said, "Yes, it is." And he said, "Well, you and the 2 girls are next. Click." Well, I'm getting to the point of the story. I went to the families and to the 2 girls. Obviously, this was not a totally empty threat. And they obviously needed to know about it. I'm not sure what they could have done about it other than pray and be vigilant and alert, but I went to both of them, and I'll never forget the conversation with Carolyn Freeman. After I had told her about the threat, I asked her, "Carolyn, are you afraid?" And Carolyn almost immediately said, "No, I'm not so much afraid as I am ashamed." I said, "Carolyn, what do you mean you are ashamed?" She said, "I'm ashamed that others have done so much and suffered so much for the freedom of my people and all people, and I have done so little." That captures not only the spirit of the times. She was aware of what was happening. This was not something that was just in the papers. She felt it in not only her bones, but in the depths of her spirit. She had a sense of those before her, those around her who were working on her behalf? Did you feel some of that in that outpouring of young people from all over the country? There's that sense that something is happening, something is moving, something is changing that is leading to the freedom of my people and all people. I'll never forget that word of hers. I mean, for a 15-year-old girl to be as articulate as she was. But above all, you notice how this awareness of what's happening, this something that's much bigger than playing records or what am I going to wear to school tomorrow, something that was really important to her, that trumped the real physical threat of the KKK. And you could see it in the spirit and the courage of the black youth and some of the white youth. By the way, that Jim Swerd, the white man, the only member of the group that went from Birmingham to Jackson, and who really got it in Montgomery, is living in Madison, is a UCC pastor, and he's changed a little bit, and he was on that film, of course, probably made up a couple of years ago. I don't think it's been out that long.
It's 2 years ago.
But I cite that story of Carolyn Freeman just to say that, yeah, that spirit of the times was real. That solidarity, to use a union word, and a spiritual word, that solidarity with people who are working for justice and for change was real. It was palpable. It was something that you'd go to Jackson, Mississippi, and to the Parchman prison for. Boy, that is something that even and I've done a few things. I could tell some stories about the pipes and the clubs that were facing us on the day that we went to Selma. But I still have that feeling of Carolyn Freeman, because I realize that there are others who have done so much more than I have. And it's one of the reasons why I have not said a whole lot about my relationship with Martin Luther King and the fact that I was part of the Committee of 20 in Birmingham and met at the Gaston Hotel with the SCLC staff and Martin Luther King and John Lewis and Jim Bevel and Ralph Abernathy. I seldom talked about it. I still seldom talk about it, precisely because I realize that the work that is yet to be done and the justice struggle is something that I had better immerse myself in deeply. And my relationship with King and my activities in Birmingham and Selma, as important as some of that was, is not the end. This is a continuum. This is a journey. And I better be on that journey and let other people talk about the meaning of the past. And I have to tell you the story as to why I wrote this book. Because I had never intended to write a book about some of my experiences and what our congregations learned in Birmingham and in Milwaukee. I've been in Milwaukee since 1967. I really did not intend ever to write a book for three reasons. First of all, I see it as a kind of tooting one's own horn when you're telling your story, even though you're talking about what you've learned and what you've learned with other people as you have engaged in the struggle for justice and for peace. So I didn't like the idea of blowing my trumpet. Number two, I really have always been so engaged in the struggle and what's coming next that I really didn't feel like I had the time to stop and write a book about it. And thirdly, as I looked at others and what others are doing and what other congregations have done, if you're looking at it from the congregational point of view or from the justice movement, what's so great about what I've done and we've done. But what brought me to do this was that in my retirement, I retired from pastoral ministry in 2001. At the end of 2001, I was pastor in Birmingham, 58 to 67, pastor at Cross Church here in Milwaukee from 67 to 2001. And in 2002, Anna Garcia Ashley, who had been the organizer with Micah way back when, convinced me that I needed to be an organizer and help Wisdom form organizations around the state to work on justice issues. And so in my retirement, I became an organizer. And that means that you meet with the staff on a regular basis and you have a set of goals. And you talk with the staff and the other organizers every week or two about how you're doing with your goals. And in one of those meetings, a 26-year-old African-American man, Chris Boston, who was the organizer with Micah at the time, said, after I had contributed something to the meeting, and I don't even remember what it was, but he said, Reverend Ellwanger, you're going to have to write a book. And I said, you're pulling my leg. And he said, no, I'm serious about it. In fact, you need to put that goal down as one of your goals, and we are going to hold you accountable. That's what organizers do. And they all said, yes, we will. So I put it down on my list of goals. And because I decided, 26-year-old African-American man says that there's, in the past, that I can tell the stories about, that really has meaning and value to him. Maybe this is a generational thing. Maybe it's one generation saying to the next that we need to remember the movie. Anybody who watches this movie and goes away untouched, unmoved about anything that needs to be changed today, or well, it's too bad it is what it is, and there's nothing we can do to change it. What shall I say? That such a person really has missed the point, and certainly what the 60s teaches, and the freedom rides, and my experience in 63 in the demonstrations in Birmingham and in 65 in Selma, is that things can be changed, and that it's when we come together and work with deep commitment that things really do change. In fact, I'm so full of stories that I could keep talking, and I'll try to wrap it up here. But C.T. Vivian, who was a key player in the story here, is still living, and in fact is to receive the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute Fred Shuttlesworth Human Rights Award next month. That he's received many other awards. A real leader, not only then, but in the Selma movement for the Voting Rights Act. He was very important and influential. But I remember that when I went for a Bloody Sunday commemoration every March 7th, or the weekend that's closest to March 7th, there is a commemoration experience in Selma. And I go as often as I can. About 5 years ago, I went and C.T. Vivian was in the hotel, St. James Hotel, right on the Alabama River in Selma. And I was at one table and he was at another. And for those of you who lived in the South in the 50s and the 60s and the Jim Crow days, this is an experience that you can't help but notice. Here's the St. James Hotel. There's an integrated staff. There's an integrated group of patrons and integrated restaurant. And you think, oh boy, things have changed. Indeed. C.T. Vivian came over to my table and he said, you know, Joel, and he was shaking almost like he had, what is the disease? Parkinson's. But it wasn't Parkinson's. He was just so excited, and this is the way he talks all the time, especially when he's preaching or he's talking to a group. And so there was the group around the table and myself, and he said, you know, Joel, when you think about what we accomplished in changing the way in which our country is living, and especially the South, when you think about what we have accomplished through our humble efforts here in Selma back in 1965, do you know what that means? That means that if a few people really come together, stick together, organize, and don't give up, we can accomplish anything. And that's really what the 60s teach us. Because when you see the depth of commitment on the part of not only the Ku Klux Klan, but just ordinary white folk in the South, that we are not going to change. This is our way of life. You can't do this to us. When you see that, the depth of that, you're tempted to think, that can never change. We can never get past that barrier. Believe me, we have to be vigilant, or it falls back into that very easily, the subtle racist patterns. But just think about what has changed so dramatically that Wilcox County, which is the county next to Dallas County in Alabama, and Lowndes County, next to Wilcox County, two counties in Alabama that didn't have a single black voter in 1965. Didn't matter whether you were a high school principal or a teacher with a PhD. If you were black, you did not vote in Lowndes County, Wilcox County. And now, praise God, black sheriffs, because they're 80% black population, and a vote changes everything. So it can be changed, and it does change. I'm going to stop, but I could talk about the concerned white citizens of Alabama that marched in Selma the day before Bloody Sunday in solidarity with the movement to the Birmingham Council on Human Relations, which was the only racially integrated group in Birmingham at the time. I happened to be president at the time. Decided that we needed to clearly support the voting rights movement in Selma, and we decided that we would send out an invitation to white folks in the state of Alabama to come and join us in Selma on March 6th to stand in solidarity with the movement. Well, we sent out the invitation, and how many do you think came? 72. And, that's a crying shame. Only 72 white folks in the state of Alabama were willing and brave enough to come to Selma and stand up in solidarity with the movement. On the other hand, we could say, hallelujah, at least 72 came, and that's actually what the response was from the black movement. We wondered just how they would feel about a small group when they've been going to jail and really putting their lives on the line and their jobs on the line. But the truth, if truth be told, when we came to the, I said I was going to quit, but I had to tell this story. Came to the county courthouse in Selma. After we had walked down Broad Street, we discovered that Lauderdale, the street along one side of the courthouse, was filled with about 300, 400 of these white yokels, and they had bats and clubs and steel pipes. They were on Lauderdale here. We were in a line facing the courthouse. There was a row of about 4 or 5 sheriff's deputies standing there with those yokels standing there with their pipes, and of course they had done nothing, so there they were. We had no idea how this was going to turn out, but the equalizing factor that saved the day for us was that on the other side, on the lawn of the federal building, which was opposite the courthouse, were about 400 African Americans who had, most of whom were so committed to the movement that they came that Saturday morning, I think partly to see whether we were going to show up, but also to protect us, and they really did protect us. If they had not been standing there, I'm not sure what the 300-400 white yokels on the opposite side would have done. As it turned out, the sheriff's deputies, after they read this telegram from in effect, my bishop, saying that the Lutheran Church does not support me, and what I'm doing on that day, after he reads the telegram, I tell him, well, Reverend Holmrighausen, my president, has a right to his own opinion, but we're here to stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters who deserve in this democracy to have a vote. May we go forward to the steps of the courthouse to make our public statement. And they could have done any number of things. They could have arrested us. They could have said, you go back where you came from. They could have just given them the hand to the yokels in the street, and they would have begun, I'm sure. But they stepped aside. We went to the steps. We had our demonstration, and went back home. Some stories that happened on the way back home, but that particular demonstration the day before Bloody Sunday demonstrates how even the good white folks of the South, and there's some carryover today yet, including my district president, who had no intention of lashing out like the KKK, and they distanced themselves from the KKK. But there was that commitment on the part of good white people, people who were not in the Ku Klux Klan, who took themselves off of the hook by saying, off the hook of involvement and commitment to bringing about real change. They took themselves off the hook by saying, well, we agree with your goals, but we don't agree with your methods.
Yeah, right. That's all we say.
And with that better stop.
Yeah, question. Agents have changed, catalysts have changed, expected. Primarily, I was very much struck by the assessment that the Kennedy and the administration viewed the civil rights movement as a, you know, as a problem, not something that they should be concerning themselves with. And I think that from a historical point of view, I was a very young man at the time, we were always, you know, the whole mythology of Camelot and their involvement in civil rights. But just, I can't help but to parallel the thought when I heard him say that, which was when Lincoln said that if he could free one slave and still achieve the same goal. That's almost the same type of attitude that was still prevailing 100 years later with Kennedy. He didn't actively involve himself or the precepts of the Constitution until it became political expedient for him to do so. That bugs me.
Oh, yeah.
Well, you've lifted up a paradigm that needs to be recognized today. The movement educated the Kennedys and educated the Congress to the point where they finally said, because they were caught between, in the Cold War, with all of the criticism that directed at the United States for talking about freedom, and yet look what's happening in your own country. And the pressures were there. But it took the movement to lift up the depth of the reality of oppression and racism, because you heard it on from, what was it, Siegenthaler, or Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, who said that there's not any prejudice.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, but it took the movement to lift up in a dramatic way how deep the oppression and the violence of the system was to black people. Otherwise, the contention was that they're happy and we're happy. What do you mean there's anything bad going on? And so there had to be this dramatic demonstration, and that's what the demonstrations in Birmingham in '63 did, and the demonstrations in '65 in Selma, and finally brought about the change. And Lyndon Johnson is the one who said, even as he signed the 1964 Civil Rights Law and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and especially the '65 Voting Rights Act, he said, there goes the white South from the Democratic Party.
Oh,
And,
yeah.
and that's exactly what happened.
He said for a decade, and he was wrong, because it's been about 5 decades.
And
He underestimated.
he did indeed, but he signed anyway, which was it showed a little bit of courage, but he was educated. He was educated, and even said in his, believe me, Bloody Sunday was the piece of the Selma movement that really finally moved the Congress and Johnson to do what they said. Well, we'll get the Voting Rights Act. We'll get a strong Voting Rights Act. Just don't push us, it takes a while.
Yeah.
For them to get a Voting Rights Act, for Congress to get an act, any act, through in 4 months, as they did with this strong Voting Rights Act, is an amazing accomplishment that today, we can't get anything through ever, much less in 4 months. You mentioned the drug policy and the drugs, and the sale of drugs and drug addiction, which came in 80 and 90 and 90s. And finally now, we are admitting that the war on drugs is a failure. not only is it a failure, but it's a piece of what has driven central cities into the violence and the young people not knowing where they're gonna, what they're gonna do with their lives. They don't have that deep sense of commitment to something big and something for the sake of the community. It's for me and mine, and so if we could recapture that, and if we could change the drug policy, we learned in the 20s how to deal with our mistake of trying to outlaw alcohol. And we finally discovered that, well, we've got to live with the tension of legalizing alcohol and at the same time helping people who get sucked into the addiction to alcohol with treatment. And we've got to do the same thing with the hard drugs. Otherwise, we continue to doom. Here I'm getting off to another topic, but you see how the challenge for the beloved community, as Dr. King described it and talked about it, the challenge to the beloved community is to constantly be vigilant and never to think that we have arrived. The Voting Rights Act of '65 is just so amazing, so powerful. It's brought about so many changes, and look what's happening, not only to the Voting Rights Act, but in the suppression of the vote today. It's those forces coming back and saying that we can't let everybody vote. We've got to clamp down on it, and so here we are back to some of the same challenges that we had, only they're in a little different appearance, and it doesn't seem to be quite as clear as it was in the '60s, but it's every bit as demeaning and as oppressive as segregation. But it's just that it's much less visible and more subtle.
So, yeah.
Most important question tonight. Can I buy a copy of the book?
Oh, can you have one? After they're published, by all means.
Oh, okay.
So, why don't we give a round of applause?